Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the second chapter in the book of James. Now, we already did the first chapter of James, and the dividing point was the 14th verse, if I remember correctly. So you can type in Corey Johnston, either James 1 through 114 or 15 through 27. We commented more extensively on the literary and historical context than we intend to in this discourse. And the reason that we're doing this is that the next 8 lessons we plan on doing are going to be from the book of James. I wanted to approach a book in its entirety, and there is a convenient structure in James. It doesn't have the length of such as Isaiah or Psalms, which spring immediately to mind as some of the lengthier books of scriptures, but also convenient points where we can break down each of the 5 chapters into 2 conceivable 15-minute lessons. And so we're going to intend to make it all the way up to the 13th verse in the second chapter. But the overarching theme we want to establish the foundation from before we analyze the text itself is going to be the theme of its very much explanation of the root causes, effects, consequences, and warnings against what is known as prejudice. And we owe it to ourselves to approach it in its broadest context. Now, in our modern culture, when we tend to think of prejudice, we think of the racial terms of prejudice, and that's because we live in a diverse, multicultural society. And the first century Christians were not immune to racial prejudice in that they had to contend with the influx of the Gentiles who were displacing the Jewish sect as the majority by this point. But the specific nature of prejudice that he addresses is by no means immune to our own. It's very much class prejudice, and this is perhaps a more universal form of prejudice. And so the theme is openly established in the opening verse where he says, "My brothers, do not hold the faith of our Master Yahshua the Messiah, the Master of esteem, with partiality." This suggests that we are not to withhold or deny or extend a helping hand to anyone on account of, for any reason. Now, the main issue of prejudice he addresses is classist connotations, the rich and the poor. It's a fact of human nature that we are inclined to associate ourselves more with the well-to-do than the less fortunate among us. But the Christian ethos is to transcend human nature or the natural man, so we want to bear that in mind. "For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings in a splendid robe, and there should also come in a poor one dressed in rags, and you pay attention to the one wearing the splendid robe, and say to him, 'You sit here in a good place,' and say to the poor one, 'You stand there, or sit by my feet.'" So he's instructing them to avoid a tendency in human nature to favor the rich at the expense of the poor. And the rich are most immediately evidenced by what they wear. If we were to walk into any location, we don't have an infallible indicator of what everyone's net worth is, but we do know it by certain things such as the car they drive or the clothes they wear. But we are to treat each one by looking at the heart, because Yahweh judges the heart, 1 Samuel 16:7, and several other locations. We are not to look at the externals, but in order to lay hold of the eternal, we are to look at the eternal and internal. I maybe fumbled over that word. But really, this is a tendency to be avoided, and the church is sadly not immune to it. And many church leaders are tithe-oriented, so they are also inclined to favor those who can donate more to their church and reach out to them more. But this is ultimately instructive to the parishioners. Now, James himself was the bishop of Jerusalem, but he did have the parishioners in mind, and it was a standard that he himself observed as the leader of the church. "Have you not discriminated amongst yourselves and become judges with wicked thoughts?" Now, everyone among us, some more than others, are discriminatory. The prejudice is to harbor preconceived notions rather than examining the evidence upon which a righteous judgment is due. We are to give each individual and case the attention and the really weigh its merits on its due. We are to not judge it by first impression. We really owe it to ourselves and to them to give them all the attention and affection that they are due. In order to give them the affection, we have to give them the attention, and so we cannot judge. There's no such thing as a righteous quick judgment. We have to take time to know people before we determine how we evaluate them. Listen, my beloved brothers, has Elohim not chosen the poor of this world, rich in belief, and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? So even though those who are poor in the world will be exalted in heaven, he who humbles himself will be exalted in the reverse. We read of this in Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, and 18:14. The paradox of the principle is that even though the world favors the rich because of what they can offer and the privilege of their association, and they have more access to enjoyable items perhaps than those who are without access to them, but Elohim does not look at humanity the way that humanity does. So we are to look at humanity as far as we are able, in as much as the Creator does. But you have shown disrespect towards the poor man. Do not the rich oppress you and drag you into the courts? So this is ultimately the irony of exalting the wealthy at the expense of the poor, and that the wealthy are very often are more often abusive of those who are perhaps middle class or of equal station. That now, to be clear, wealth in itself is arrived at by various means and various motives. So it's almost unfair, and it would defeat the point of this passage to suggest that all wealthy people are invariably evil. Some of them inherit their money, others have rapacious ambition, others are just diligent workers, and there's really nothing wrong with prosperity in itself. It's really when we prioritize it as the chief end in life itself that it becomes the host of evil, not only in itself, but the host of other evils. Do they not blaspheme that good name by which you are called? Now, blasphemy was the third commandment of the Decalogue in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, which essentially brought the name into disrepute. Now, we can generalize the sin by using the name itself in the profane, literally and explicitly using the name in profane or vulgar or demeaning terms, but ultimately we represent the name in the broadest context when we exercise any service on his behalf, and we are not to limit ourselves to our church location. So we do want to approach everything in this in the broadest possible context. We really owe it to ourselves and to others, and above all to him. If you truly accomplish the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. Now this injunction was familiar to James's audience. He was being located in Jerusalem. His audience would have been primarily comprised of Jews, and they would have been familiar with the old passage injunction in Leviticus 19:18, where the Israelites were commanded to love the neighbor as themselves. And incidentally, I did write extensively on this topic in a book that I wrote, Corey Johnston, who is my neighbor, an extensive commentary on the Good Samaritan parable. I, in all honesty, did not plan on but I do have this by my side because this is the same location I filmed the majority of these discourses, and these discourses do take a life of their own, and they are an organic process, and most of the things I say, I haven't the slightest idea I'm going to say them before I say them. I do take certain precautions, such as study and prayerful premeditation, but ultimately it's an extemporaneous exegesis. But more to the point and relevant, the royal law is really, that's a terminology unique to James, to the principle of neighborly love, which was to govern the Jewish and the Christian faith. And it is essential that we love our neighbors for no simple it's utilitarianly useful to love those, and as well as beneficial to us and to others. Now, society cannot function, and a church or assembly cannot function without neighborly love, and we are to have the broadest possible context of our neighbors. In this book that I wrote, the Jew who posed the question to the master, we read that he ultimately wanted to restrict the sense of who his neighbor was. So even though he had answered the question correctly of what shall I do to inherit eternal life, and the master says, what is written in the law? And he gives the simplified and succinct summary that incidentally echoes or preempts the master's own two greatest commandments, love Yahweh and love your neighbor or fellow man. But the Jews by this time had restricted the conception of neighbor to exclude as many people as possible. But that's ultimately, I feel I'm losing track of time here. But if you show partiality, you commit sin, being found guilty by the Torah as transgressors. So when we think of prejudice as a sin or partiality, that dramatically alters our perception and will incline us to avoid it. And we read that he has a very broad view on what constitutes transgression in the 10th verse, which reads, "For whoever shall keep all the Torah and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all." Now, there are 10 essential commandments as outlined in the Decalogue, but how many? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So if there's a weak link in the chain, we are essentially as guilty as if they were all guilty. Now, if we were pulled over for speeding, would we rest our case on the fact that we paid our taxes? We wouldn't have much of a chance, and we have to bear that in mind. And no sin is particularly more grievous than any others. I feel in the contemporary context that homosexuals ultimately are a whipping boy of sorts amongst many Christian churches, and I do consider it a sin, but no more grievous than any others. And it's ultimately, I feel, more often than not, a species of self-righteousness when it's condemned from the pulpit, because what it does is, because the majority of Christians do not in fact struggle with that sin, it allows them to elevate their esteem and righteousness of themselves because it's not a sin they struggle with. But if even just because you don't have homosexual fantasies and you rip your neighbor off or show prejudice, and incidentally there is such a thing as homophobia, which is a species of prejudice, so we want to bear that in mind, that no sin is greater or worse than any others. They are all equally guilty, anyone who commits them. For he who said, "Do not commit adultery," also said, "Do not murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the Torah. So the commandments all spring from a similar point of origin, and that is in the omniscient and omnipotent and all-loving Elohim, who issues these commands because he loves us. Now, why wouldn't he want us to cheat on our wives? Because it's an act of faith. We're to be faithful to our wives and husbands. Males are not the exclusive purveyors of adultery or fornication. And do not murder, but if you don't commit adultery, are you really that much better if you kill someone? That's certainly an extreme scenario. Now, murder certainly has a deeper connotation, is in some sense a more serious sin, at least in itself, in that it is rarer than stealing or any of the others, and it carries the most grievous consequences. But in any case, you can substitute any other sin as outlined in the Decalogue with any of these given. The principle remains universally applicable. So speak and do as those who are to be judged by a Torah of freedom. Now, a Torah of freedom is on the face value a contradiction in terms, and we expressed this in one of the previous discourses of James, but is ultimately a source of liberty. These restrictions and injunctions and thou shalt nots, they are in order, we don't do these things in order to lay claim of something that is positive. So we want to bear that in mind. That is the other side of the coin of the perfect paradox of the Torah of freedom or liberty. For the judgment is without compassion to the one who has shown no compassion, and compassion boast over judgment. This reminds us of the precept of Scripture, you reap what you sow. This was written by, for, and to an agricultural-minded people, but the nearest equivalent I can think of is the moral law of cosmic effect, familiar in our culture, but originated in the Hindu religion of karma, whereby if you want to be treated, you will be treated as you treat others, and that is ultimately the one who we have to answer to and who judges us. If we are not forgiving, he is not obligated to forgive us, and that is a principle we need to bear in mind and ignore it at our own peril. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye. See you then.